Hey Goose, what you doing, Goosey Goose?
Oh, I was just gonna...
Anyway, we've got a game for you to review.
No, I know you guys are doing Flight, and I'm not gonna do any more Flight games.
No, Goose, we're reviewing Flight. We got you this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but no more Flight game, because we all know I'm not gonna do It's a Flight game.
You'll be needing these.
Thank you.
So it's goggles on, chocks away, throttle up, and tally-ho, as I gear up for some good old-fashioned flyboy tomfoolery.
I have no idea what any of that means.
There they are! Lieutenant, attack the one to the right.
The majority of Birds of Steel chooses to focus heavily on the conflict that took place over the Pacific, as you take part in historic encounters like the massive Battle of Midway, the fight for Wake Island, and of course the infamous Pearl Harbor attack. There's a relatively short campaign that allows you to fly for both sides, and each of these contains a handful of historically accurate missions. These range from aerial dogfights through to some search and destroy missions that mostly include dive bombing and torpedoing enemy targets.
What's that? Fire on deck? Haha, looks like it.
Unfortunately, a lot of these missions involve some really long and tedious flights between checkpoints, and these tend to happen at the start and end of most of the missions. If you're stuck flying for 2 minutes in a straight line, it's really going to kill the buzz you just got from that last dogfight. However, what makes these missions so interesting is the rich and detailed history behind them. Particularly because they're bookended by some of the best historic footage I've ever seen in a video game. Plus, they're all narrated exquisitely by the one and only Stephen Fry.
However, the attack was not nearly as devastating as it could have been. The Japanese failed to damage their main target, the American aircraft carriers.
Once you're finished with the campaign, you can select from a large number of scenarios, and this is where I spent the majority of the game. Without some of the historical limitations, these missions are all about putting you right in the middle of the action. For instance, one of them has you strafing fire on an enemy runway at night while avoiding spotlights, and the next has you outnumbered and flying dangerously low through a mountain range. It's a lot more varied than the campaign, showing off more locations, more aircraft, and lots more enemy types. Running into a couple of bogeys is also quite a thrill. The AI in the game is aggressive, but it's still fair, and they will stick to you like glue if you let them get on your tail. But I did think my AI gunner partner could have used a bit of target practice. I was constantly switching over to do his job for him, which would have been fine if he knew how to fly a plane, but no. He was happy to sit at the controls and watch us plunge into the ocean. When you combine these scenarios with the almost infinite possibilities in the mission editor, you can see the developers have included plenty of options for you to make your own fun if you tinker around with them long enough. There's plenty of aircraft to play around with as well, and while it might be a smaller percentage than, say, car enthusiasts, if you consider yourself an expert on anything with wings, this is essentially your version of Forza. There's about 100 aircraft to unlock, and they can all be examined and customised in the hangar. Want to send a message straight to the enemy, or just missing that special someone back home? Why not slap on a fancy decal or two? Another one down there. Delightful. When it comes to actually getting your bucket of bolts off the ground and into the air, Birds of Steel has an interesting number of options to accommodate for your skill level. These are summed up in 3 choices: simplified, realistic, and simulator. The first setting is where you're going to have the most fun with the game. Simplified allows you to thrash the plane about without too much concern for losing control. Enemies take less damage, and there's more HUD information like a leading aim reticule during the dogfights. You'll breeze through the campaign in this setting, but you'll also gain less XP, which you're going to need later on to unlock more aircraft. Realistic turns on some of the harsher physics in the game, and you'll have to watch how sharply you turn or you'll send yourself into an exhilarating but downright dangerous spin. Then there's the simulation mode, which takes away all of your assists and just makes it a challenge to stay in the air, let alone avoid enemy fire. It's harsh, but both of these tougher difficulties offer more than just increased XP. I don't know if it was just because these planes would have been really hard to fly back in the day, but I never felt satisfied finishing a game on simple, and I'd usually jump straight back in the cockpit and try a tougher difficulty just to do the mission justice. Plus, there's a great sense of accomplishment when you bring your plane in for that perfect landing on simulation. Just gonna put the nose down here and... Another mission being a console exclusive, the game's been built around the limitations of a controller, but the default controls are a bit derpy. The right stick controls your throttle and everything else is on the left. Luckily, you can remap all the buttons and sticks to your own liking, and you'll quickly fall into a really comfortable flying groove. Once you're up and about in the air, the scenery can also be a bit of a mixed bag. The majority of the missions over the water look great, especially at dusk, but I thought some of the ground units were a bit flat and lifeless. That was until they started firing at me. I don't know if the exploding flak was actually doing any damage, but it was that exciting I just turned my plane around and fly back through it. Watch out! Each of the aircraft also has a fully detailed cockpit view to choose from, but some of the older aircraft, especially the biplanes, are almost impossible to see out of. So I just stuck to the behind view for the majority of the game, which I usually never do in a flight simulator. This looks particularly awesome when you lock onto an enemy, loop after him before blasting it out of the sky. And this is where my main love affair with the game lies, in the dogfighting. I think there's just too many games these days with automatic settings and modern weaponry that do all the work for you. So it's really refreshing to play a good old-fashioned game where you have to switch to your guns and go after your targets manually. This carries over to the multiplayer too. Matches can be set up in a similar fashion to the scenarios, with AI bots filling in any empty slots just to make sure the skies are always full of chaos. I also didn't mind a couple of the objective-based games that I initially thought wouldn't work in a flight combat game. Like any good sim, Birds of Steel is packed full of detail, but it still manages to maintain that arcade action-y feel when it comes to the actual flying. You can tell the developers have made a real effort to squeeze in as much content as possible, particularly for the odd World War II fighter pilot enthusiast out there. This, however, is also my main concern, as anyone who's not really invested in this genre of game might not have the legs to slug it through some of the duller, longer missions at the beginning, and therefore won't unlock the really cool aircraft and some of the more exciting missions later on, which is a shame because there are some really fantastic moments in this game. Still, having those varied difficulties makes this a game that's accessible to almost anyone who wants to try flying some of aviation's greatest machines, so I'm giving it an 8 out of 10. Alright, to the skies!